G'day, guys. Let's just listen to Grundy in one of his recent conversations with Tom Bailey and what he had to say about the blue zones, because he actually worked in one of them. You might find this very insightful. Let me just share my screen. So here's Grundy talking about the issue that we're oops.
I'm the only nutritionist that spent most of my career living in a blue zone, Loma Linda, California. It's the only blue zone in the United States, by the way.
Sad. So here was cardiologist working at in a blue zone, which is Loma Linda.
And one of the things that shocked me when I moved to Loma Linda,
this is the thing that shocked him. I think it will surprise a lot of you people as well,
was the amount of fat, and particularly dairy fat, in the Adventist diet.
Did you hear that? Fat, animal fat from dairy sources in the Adventist diet. You know, we've always been told how, you know, the Adventist diet is, all these damn plants and stuff like that. Yes. Remember the actual study that that Bart tore apart to bits, the old study, which is an Adventist study back, this is way, way back in the, when was it? It's about 1950s, approximately in the 1950s. I can't remember exactly which year. Back then, you had no refrigeration, so it was all seasonal. Seasonal starch, seasonal fruit. So you got fruit for a smaller bit of the year, seasonal starch. And you had various different vegetables throughout the whole year, depending on the season. And that's how it went. So the only things that are all available all year round are dairy, eggs, seafood, and ruminant meat, land animals. So obviously they exclude, unless they're pescatarians, they exclude the other ones. But the primary stuff that they did consume was, that's mostly available, dairy and eggs. And you know, Grundy, he actually, you know, Steve Grundy actually worked in that area. You know, he's an insider. You know, he's been plant-based for years. He's sort of now low carb, you know, keto, plant-based or whatever, but he's still plant-based. That's his sort of logic in that regard. But you can see the cognitive dissonance, even though he spurts this stuff out, telling you most of the diet was coming from that. It's still basically, he goes on these other things about the polyphenols and all that. We'll cover that in a future video. I just wanted to cover this about, you know, what are the real blue zones like? Let's just check this out. Coming from a person who's very close to the Vagunarized community.
And I met with the nutritionist at the hospital, and because the food in the hospital cafeteria, and Adventists are vegetarians or vegans. About 36% of Adventists are vegetarians. About 5% are vegans.
So 36% are vegetarians, 36% only. That's never told, is it? 5% are vegans, so that's 40. So 60%, the majority of them. And remember when Bart looked at the data and looked at the inverse, that, you know, it actually was showing the inverse effect. People were eating more animal foods, were actually healthier, were actually living longer. It was the other way around of what is advertised. And the reality is 60% of the Adventists, they consume, But, you know, they don't consume processed food. They don't consume alcohol. They don't smoke. So they have a lot of healthy user bias. So they're not basically doing any of these things that are actually harming them. They're not going to McDonald's. They're not boozing all day long, and they're not smoking. So primarily it's from whole foods. And if you're actually, you know, those people that are going to basically be eating more animal foods. And back then there was no refrigeration in the 1950s, remember, very limited refrigeration. So as a consequence, people are eating seasonally. So you can bet that even those that 60% of the inventors were actually consuming high quality animal foods, you know? So, but we've got the bullshit that's been promoted for a very, very long time is because, and they have to go back to a study all the way back to the 1950s. They quote that study over and over again, which was adjusted, manipulated, and all that. But that's what they used, and that's how they deceive people, you know, the plant-based community. What if they do something today? And let's do a comparison. They're never going to do that. You know why? Because it'll upend their whole philosophy and whole ideology, because that's all it is. It's an ideology, you know, and they can't go back to doing it now in the modern era where people are eating, even in these areas, they're no longer blue zones. That's a myth. Nowadays, they're eating a whole lot of junk, processed garbage, and their life expectancy, all these blue zones, their life expectancies are collapsing. And the reason because the introduction of a lot of processed foods in these communities. But anyway, let's get on with it.
Number are pescatarians. But so,
and a number of pescatarians. The last time I remember, a fish is meat and high in taurine as well, compared to ruminant animals. So very good source of taurine as well. Thank you very much.
a great deal of the Adventists are vegetarians or at least pescatarians.
Right.
Well, you said 36%, not a great deal. You know, a third of the, well, 36% is slightly over a third, but it's still relatively a third. If we add the vegans, it's probably 40%. Still 60% are basically people that are eating either pescatarians or, well, actually, because they're vegetarians, they're still in at 36%. So the rest are meat eaters, you know, basically.
And yet 50% of their diet was dairy fat.
Did you hear that? 50% of their diet was dairy fat. 50% of their diet was dairy fat. Got it? So if you basically then put a pescatarian or somebody that eats meat, you're basically back to about 2/3 animal food, 1/3 plants. I don't consider that an animal-based, you know, a plant-based diet. And then the other ones who are just doing dairy and eggs, well, they're basically then, and 50%. So even if you're doing eggs, 55, 60%, some of the others, 2/3, some of the others. So as you can see how the whole thing crumbles. He was there. He saw it. He was in the hospital, the Adventist hospital, and saw their dietary approach. Now, in the modern era, it's actually quite changed compared to back then. Then it had to be very seasonal because there was no refrigeration. So it was based on what was available. And so they prioritized those nutrients. And back then, still, we hadn't had the low fat, because he was in the 70s back then. So the low fat ideology had not permeated that part of the world either. So they were still doing exactly what they'd been doing since the 50s and 60s and earlier, you know. Coming from the horse's mouth, not me saying it. Grundy himself, he was there.
From
Whoa,
yogurts,
50%?
50%.
You do hear that? 50% was dairy. The last time I remember, that's an animal food. That's excluding eggs. That's which those vegetarians do. And then if you add, what are the you know, the other ones that are actually the fish munching, you know, Adventists. You know, the numbers look for animal foods, way up. The component of plant foods is shrinking just as they talk.
Yogurts
A lot.
and cheeses.
Got it? Yogurts and cheeses.
And I'm going, you're killing, my patients. I'm a heart.
So him as an ignorant, even back then he was ignorant, cardiologist. Oh, you're killing my patients.
Surgeon, I'm a cardiologist. You're killing my patients. And they go, no, we're not. We're the longest living people in the United States. Do your homework. I go, you're killing our patients.
So basically, because they'd be seasonal and eating seasonally, they wouldn't be engaging the Randall's hog because they're eating so much animal food. They're probably getting 2/3. They're physically active back then because a lot of people are doing physical work. So you're depleting glycogen. You're in a low carbohydrate state with a high animal diet. Yeah, it may be coming from dairy, but it's still an animal-based diet. You can't argue against that. Grundy's telling you because he was there and he disagreed with them, and they told him off and told him, no, we know best. You stick to your lane as a cardiologist and stop telling us what to do, since we've been doing it for quite some time, feeding these people a high-fat, dairy-based diet, and we're living longer than other Americans that are guzzling down the sugar and the seed oils.
So as I was researching this book, I said, the Adventists eat a lot of cheese and dairy. Let's look at the other blue zones. So you look at.
So now he's talking about how he's looking at the other blue zones and what they're consuming and stuff like that.
Sardinia, which is another blue zone. You look at the Nagoyan Peninsula in Costa Rica, which is another blue zone. You look at Icaria, which is a Greek island.
So he's talking about those, those other key ones. So you've got, Melinda, no, alone Melinda. You've got basically Icaria in Greece, Sardinia in part of Italy, an island off the coast of the west coast of Italy. You've basically got down in the Nagoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, you've got a community there. And then also you've got basically the Okinawans. And we've covered the Okinawans about their high consumption of pork, and historically, and also their food restriction, which we know actually extends life when you restrict the amount of energy intake. And they do that, it's like a religion. They've got a saying, to eat until you're 80% full. So it's very much a different lifestyle and quite physically involved as well.
And lo and behold, the Sardinians are unique in that the Sardinians are basically two populations. There's the folks who live up in the mountain and the folks who live down by the sea. It turns out only the people who live up in the mountain have longevity.
And I've said that before to you guys when I was talking about Sardinia, and I was talking about also Icaria, that is the people in those areas that are living up herding goats, that are basically living the long life.
That's interesting.
And they're sheep herders and goat herders, and they eat huge amounts of goat and sheep cheese.
They don't only do that, they eat shitloads of goat and lamb meat as well, something that he likes to exclude because it's just so inconvenient, damn. But he's right. It's only the people up there. Don't go down. Bottom people that are basically the tourist people. It's like my grandfather, my great-grandfather lived 107. What was he? He was a pastoralist. He lived in the mountains. He basically ate dairy and meat. He hated vegetables. And he was the one that used to fill up his pistol, remember, and shoot the flies because he hated them. It's a well-known Sopranos thing. We all hate flies. Yes, if I could get a sort of a Gatling gun, a little miniaturized Gatling gun that actually can fire little pellets of salt to kill off the flies, I'd be taking out flies left, right, and center. It'd be really enjoyable. It's a really, it's a thing that we Sopranos really vehemently are at war with the fly. Just letting you know. So if you're a pro-fly person, basically, yes, the royal finger. Anyway, let's move on.
The folks who live down by the sea aren't goat and sheep herders, and they don't eat goat and sheep cheese. So
Got it? Obviously, they're guzzling down olive oil and basically any other foods of civilization. Yes, not very good. That's why they don't live as long as the guys, the people are up in the mountains that don't have access to that shit.
there was a beautiful paper, we didn't put it in the book, but I'll tell you, that showed that the difference was the fact that these guys were eating goat and sheep cheese. So now you go, well, wait a minute, what?
Is that all? So we're going to exclude completely the meat eating, just focus on the, fair enough. We'll cover that point anyway, that he's
so
going to
cool
go
about
into.
goat and sheep cheese?
Something in there that's uncoupling mitochondria. I have a hunch.
You got it. It turns out that 30% of the calories in goat and sheep milk are
Energy.
medium chain triglycerides, MCTs. In fact, most of the MCT fats are named after the Latin word for goat, capra.
Yes, I've said that before. Yes, that's well known.
Capric acid, caprylic acid,
All of them.
goat, because goat milk and sheep milk have tons of MCTs. And
it's really bloody tasty. I really enjoy goat cheese. And my father actually lives off it. If you go to his home, he'll have a bit of sheep, but the majority is all goat. And he always, as I'm leaving if I turn up to have a meal with him, he just gives me some goat cheese to take with me. He's looking after me. He's helping uncouple my mitochondria to look after me. So yes. But there is another way of actually doing that. It's called a ketogenic diet. It increases mitochondrial uncoupling protein levels and activity. Well, there you go. So do you necessarily? So on a low carbohydrate diet or a keto carnivore diet, the way we do it, where we're not shoving in when we're keeping it clean, that is, basically we achieve the same sort of uncoupling. His sort of argument is that because these blue zones are basically uncoupling their mitochondria without necessarily having to go into ketosis, I sort of disagree, because these people are basically eating a low carbohydrate type diet for most of the year round, other than the seasonal periods. So as a consequence, they are in this low grade ketosis. That's what you notice with the tribal people like the Maasai and all that, this low grade, which basically does provide some level of uncoupling. Add to that, you basically, rather than, both thermogenically getting rid of some of the excess energy, you're basically not storing it. That's his whole argument. And as like the Okinawans that are basically restricting intake of energy, as a consequence, they are also achieving something similar, which gives you, longer life as a consequence, because that's what a lot of the research is showing, that a certain level of energy restriction does play a role, or whether you achieve it through this uncoupling process as well, which means you're not storing, but you're turning it into heat.
remember, MCTs are unique in that they go directly to the liver and generate ketones. So these guys were generating ketones just by eating goat and sheep cheese.
Got it? But you can do a keto diet and get the same thing. But obviously, there is some value in uncoupling mitochondria, and there is some value. I've talked about this before, so I'm not going to get into it at this stage. This was more to cover this so-called blue zone. So obviously he's going into other tangents about that, but we'll just watch a bit more.
Let's jump to the Nagoyan Peninsula. Now, a lot of bean eating and corn eating in Costa Rica and on the Nagoyan Peninsula. But what's so unique about the Nagoyan Peninsula is that they're goat and sheep herders. And there's a beautiful paper that showed the difference is the goat and sheep cheese, not the beans and corn.
But cows don't do it for some reason.
No, they don't make MCTs. Let's jump to Acaria.
So you got it. So the people on that Nagoya Peninsula, while they may consume some, they may take in some beans and all that, and how much, I've never seen real good research on that. They are basically goat and herd sheep. Now, other people around the coastal areas of the Nagoya Peninsula, they do consume beans like the rest of Costa Rica, but they don't live as long. Again, it's not the people living close to the coast and all that are eating the beans and the processed and the foods of civilization. It's these goat herders and sheep herders in the mountains who are living the long life. They're not going to be consuming a lot of beans because that means you have to purchase them. You have to go down to the store and purchase them when you've got your own rich foods up there. So yes, they may have some potentially, but you know what? It's going to be a very small amount. And usually when they do process these sort of, I've seen them like in Greece in some villages, they go through a whole lot of process, like my father, whole week, soaking them until all the anti-nutrients are broken down. So you're getting a bit, and that's sort of more like a filler. You make a soup, like a fish soup, and you put some of the beans in and create a filler. It's more of a filler. It's not the main meal in that regard. And that's how beans are used in that sort of culture, because that's how they've been used in a number of villages in Greece as well. So it's not exactly the same as having a big freaking bowl of lentils or a big freaking bowl of beans like Westerners do, or a big freaking bowl of, anything else. Even pasta, it's small amounts. Even in Italy, you've got antipasto, which is the actual meat, and then you've got a little bit of pasta after with a few other things and a whole lot of meat products, so it's not the same. So the amount makes the poison, so to speak.
Acaria. Two factors in Acaria. They're goat and sheep herders.
We know that goat and sheep herders because basically Mary Ruddock has gone and spoken to them and gone amongst them and knows quite well the ones living up in the mountain areas, they're goat and sheep. They live the longest. The ones around the coastal area, they do live longer than some other Greeks because they don't consume a lot. Remember that young bloke in that video that I did on Icaria, that young bloke that basically didn't really consume much. They only have one actual bakery, and it's primarily used by tourists and people like that. So they don't really consume a lot of those sort of, even the people down in the coast. And so they do live longer than the remainder of Greece. But the ones in the mountains, they live the longest. And again, it's the reason that they are consuming a higher proportion of animal foods coming from both the dairy and the ruminant, which is the sheep and the goat.
Have yogurt every day. They have goat.
Yes, we know we have yogurt every day because we actually also do tzatziki, which we love quite a bit. Especially in Greece, you do a lot of tzatziki. Everybody does throughout the whole country. It's sort of a national pastime. You don't make a main meal without tzatziki, which is a yogurt and garlic sort of flavor to it and also you cut in cucumbers, but the cucumbers are basically, you take off all the skin and you take out the seeds and you cut them into fine amount and you squash it. So it's only the pulp, which has got it's low deuterium water in that pulp, and you squash all that and you put that in and mix it in a small proportion, and you put it through this special strainer, so you don't get any seeds or anything like that, because you don't want to be biting on seeds, accidentally getting them in your teeth. So you take all that sort of stuff out. You're in a strainer, so you're really getting the low deuterium water from the actual, and also you're getting that pulp. You're getting none of the actual external stuff, and so it's a sort of a light. You get this and then you combine it with garlic, a bit of garlic, and you mix it up and you create this sort of like a pesto type and then that's combined, put in the yogurt and mixed up. So that's really how we sort of do it, just to give you an idea.
Goat and sheep cheese every day, and they eat a weed, a common weed called purslane, as a major part of their diet. People see purslane growing in sidewalks.
That's purslane. My mother used to make, actually, when we were sort of like fasting. And so you're doing a fasting mimicking diet, fasting. So for Greek Orthodox certain events, we used to, this is one of the stuff that was put in with some of the other wild herbs that basically created that sort of meal. And not even olive oil, it was just lemon juice. That's it. You know, we're talking about austere. It is, after all, a religious fast you're doing. Oops, back here.
Cracks all the time. It's moss roses, portulaca that people have in their gardens. They eat it as salads. It turns out that purslane has an amazing short chain omega fat called alpha linolenic acid that I profile in the book. Alpha linolenic acid is magnificent for uncoupling mitochondria. So it turns out that 4 of the 5 blue zones get their benefit by uncoupling mitochondria.
Got it? 4 of the 5 blue zones, and the 5th one I've just discussed, the Okinawans, that basically time restrict feeding. So they're in this low grade, low carb, but also they are basically in this time in restricting, food restriction, which also extends life, we know. Plus they do eat shitloads of pork, and pork has other benefits I've discussed other times. So it's very high, nice, and very high, which helps the mitochondria, very high in thiamine, also helps energy production. So they, and the purple sweet potatoes are very fibrous, and basically they don't have a lot of sugar. They're very basically much lower in sugar content. It's a bit like, you know, you get 2 types of pumpkins, the sweet pumpkin and the other one, which is really bland and doesn't really has very low amounts of sugar. It's the same sort of difference, you know. So yeah, not the same as the highly sugarized, you know, commercial Western golden sweet potatoes. Not the same. Let's make that quite clear. So the man himself telling us about the blue zones and how they consume a highly pastoral diet. So basically all 3 of those populations, Costa Rica, Sardinia, Icaria, Greece, are pastoralists. Got it? The other ones, Loma Linda, are basically, you know, you could call them pastoralists as well, but, you know, they just don't actually have the animals themselves. They just go and buy it in the store, those foods. But in a sense, they're eating like pastoralists. And then the other one, love the little piggy, you know, the Okinawans, you know, piggy for, you know, we start them, they say we start the day with pork and we finish the day with pork. So they're literally consuming the little piggy in large amounts. So yes, and also they're having these little meals because they restrict the intake. So so, and a lot of these foods also are very much the plants that are much lower, you know, in terms of sugar. You know, it's like sweet potato. It's a purple sweet potato that's much lower in the starch component. So their diet is not a very high starch diet. If you look at the other plants that they use, it's a lot of green plants and stuff like that, like some of these weeds and a lot of it, which they mix up in a lot of bowls, and they make a lot of soups and stuff like that, a lot of fish soups and pork soups and pork meals and fish meals. So eggs and things like that. So it's very different than what you've told. Yes, they do have some legumes and they do have some this purple sweet potato, and they do combine some of those sort of things in, but that's not the main part of their food, what they eat traditionally in that part. But as you can see, the picture is not exactly the way it's been described to us by the Vagoonerized community or the the academics out there who do very shonky research and deliberately misinform the public. And we know from the Ikaria stuff that that basically Mary Rudder covered, and I'll put that up here. And she basically talked about a lot of this, how even the actual study itself, guys, the study itself was bonkers. I mean, it didn't even include any of the other ruminant animals, didn't even include dairy. And basically they didn't even understand culturally that meat, the word meat in Greece translates to beef and only beef. And when you're on these islands, you have to import beef, so you don't eat a lot. It's primarily goat and sheep that you consume, and a bit of fish on these islands, and pork as well. They do have a lot of pork belly and stuff like that they enjoy. So once you start unraveling, even Grundy himself, Steve himself, was there at the time, and this is before the Adventists went to shit, where now out there the diet has been altered quite a bit. But you're not going to see any research coming out of there. The older people are still eating the way they were eating in the past. So they're still living longer. But the younger ones, forget it. They're eating processed shit and all that. And so that even they recognize that. When you honestly put the pressure on them, they'll say, yeah, it's completely different now than what it was back then. Yes, but they don't tell us exactly how it was back then. Grundy just told you. It was 50% dairy foods, let alone if you take in the other foods and all that. And Bart, when he actually looked at that study, the 1950 study, and basically did the examination of that, realized, oh, it's actually the reverse of what they're saying. They actually adjusted the data to suit their own ideology. Say no more. So yes, hope you enjoyed this little rant and takedown on the so-called blue zone mythology that has been perpetuated by a lot of people. And we don't need to eat a vagoonerized plant-based thing. I'll cover polyphenols and all that because yes, some of them do have an uncoupling effect, but also have a lot of negative effects, and we don't need those negative effects to get the same results. Yes, uncoupling does help in, it seems to have some positive benefits, but basically that's what a keto diet does. So being on a low carb diet of any sort, you're going to get far more uncoupling than you're going to get on any other diet. So you don't even have to take supplemental MCTs or any other ketone esters or whatever. You just do the diet and basically you get the benefits. So anyway, that's about it. See yous.